As the hitting intensifies, it's 1-0 Montreal. On a power play for another 50 seconds. Richards trying to scoot in there alone. Halak way out of the net. It pinballs to the crease. Score! Mike Richards!
The Flyer captain is announcing his presence as the alpha male early in this one. Big hit. Sets up that cranker from Coburn, the defenseman joining the attack. They win a puck deep in their own zone. Hammerleck and the goaltender Halak collide. Oh, did they ever. And it's a tap in for Richards.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah, and I'm here with Chef B, who's going to tell us about one of our sponsors here. Chef?
Yeah, O&B Puckcast is now brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. The winter months can be especially hard on our homes, from roof damage and peeling siding to frozen pipes and toilet overflows. Call Summit Public Adjusters before you call your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be stressful and confusing. Let Summit Public Adjusters take the stress out of the claim process by having our guys work for you. Get the most for your money and your repairs. The next time the big snow or the rain leaves you with some home damage, contact us for a free consultation. Summit Public Adjusters are licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Learn more at summitpublicadjusters.com or call 215-752-0560. Just tell them that the chef sent you.
Yeah, what was that number again, Chef?
215-752-0560.
That's terrific. All right, we're going to carry on with the rest of our show. Okay, so we are back. Welcome to the O&B Special Flyers 5x5, Volume 2, 5x5. 5 topics, 5 minutes. Try to be concise and hit the high points and most important aspects of any issue regarding the Flyers, the NHL, and, of course, what's going on at the current time. So we might cheat on that a little bit because some of these subjects might need a little more attention. But either way, I'm pleased to be with our guest today, Anthony DiMarco from thefourthperiod.com. And how you doing, man?
Not too bad, man. How about yourself?
Okay. Just trying to get through this rotten period of Flyers hockey. Yet another with a streaky team. After last year, it's really, they've fallen back to what they were. And I guess that brings us to the first topic. Let's not bury the lead. You were in attendance on the phone conference with Chuck Fletcher, and maybe you could sum up what he had to say and give some feedback, your opinion about the general tone of it, and maybe if there are any nuggets in there for the people listening.
Well, I think to sum it up, he acknowledged that the team hasn't been good enough. He cited the defensive play and subpar goaltending in particular as to why they are where they are. He was asked directly about the coaching. He kind of danced around it and said, it starts at the top with him and trickles down all the way to the roster, all the cliche type of responses. But I mean, it was, he said that, the product that he put on the ice wasn't for a lack of trying. He said that a lot of teams weren't willing to eat salary during the off season, and that, he was on the phone more so than he had ever been before, but, the financial restrictions across the league and whatnot. But, I mean, look, it seemed like he acknowledged that something is off with the team. I believe he used the term, and I'm going to cite Charlie O'Connor with this, acknowledgement that the mix isn't right does hint at significant moves in the future. But again, there was no specifics as to when. And it just seemed to me that he had this press conference to kind of deflect the attention away from the on roster and the on ice roster rather, and the coaching staff. And if I had to put a bow on it, I would basically have to say that he's not going to do anything major before the end of the season. He basically said at the beginning of the presser that he's not in sell mode right now. He would look at moves to improve the team, another cliche response. But if I think it was just basically confirming that for more or less this is probably going to be the roster that lasts the entirety of the rest of the season, and the bigger moves will likely come in the offseason.
That was a moment of silence for all the Flyer fans. I just wanted to observe that out of respect. I don't know what to say. We talked about before we got on. He was hired to do stuff, intelligent stuff, the kind of stuff that Ron Hextall was not willing to do. And let me hit you with this. Last week's show, we had Jason Martinez on. And I know you're up there in Montreal, but you know Jason, of him.
Of course.
And, we were talking about with this squad, you have to look at what's been going on since 2014. And here we are in 2021, which is an eternity, and say, hey, this ain't happening. We need a fundamental change. We tried last year to salvage the project that Ron Hextall put in place. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. With Niskanen leaving, it was like pulling a thread on a fabric and watching it all unravel. And
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and now is the time, and this is something Bill Meltzer actually agreed with. I was surprised. I had a long thread, I think it was this morning, speaking of threads, how maybe the Flyers need to be in the mode that they were back in 06, 07, when Holmgren first came in, and they got rid of guys that just weren't getting it done. They sent a message to the players that were going to be here, that there were changes that were going to be made, so they had to pick up their play. Guys that were on the bubble needed to fight for jobs through their play on the ice, and that they were going to be active and making changes. I understand they were making a lot of cap space and it was different, but there's a way to do that right now to say, look, we're turning the page on this. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. And yeah, he said today he's not going to overreact with young players and how they're handling the compacted schedule and the pandemic. Fine. But you have to start kicking in the gear. That's what he was hired for. Your thoughts?
Well, one thing that he said, and it was kind of striking to me in a negative way, is that he basically said we have to be careful about overanalyzing this season. And I believe it was Mike Sealski who asked him directly about it, that there's kind of like a pattern that's been developing here since 2012. Like the inconsistency, one season on, one season off in terms of making the playoffs. And after he reiterated the overanalyzing this season, he basically said, well, it's only my second year here, so I can't speak to what went on before here. But, we're not overanalyzing this season. In reality, last season was the anomaly. And I think a lot of it had to do with, the new coach bump in Alain Vigneault, the players like Giroux and Voracek and Couturier, and to a lesser extent Provorov finally getting that supporting cast that they had lacked for all those years since Hextall took over. But this is not the fan base overreacting to one season where, the club just fell on its face and, there was an anomaly. Like, I think that argument could have been made in 2013 in the lockout shortened season, where, you were coming off of 6 straight years in the playoffs, a Stanley Cup final appearance, 2 trips to the Eastern Conference, only 1 year where they didn't make it past the first round. and that was in 2008-09 against the Pittsburgh Penguins. So like, when Holmgren basically, and I don't remember this exactly, but when he didn't blow up the team or trade Claude Giroux and Jake Voracek after a bad season in 2013, it made sense because that wasn't an anomaly. And even after that year, he did make significant changes. He brought in Mark Streit and Vincent Lecavalier. So, I mean, for Fletcher to kind of say that we can't overanalyze this season, it's kind of like, well, no, we're analyzing 7 years worth of seasons and 7 years of just an underperforming bunch. And that's not directly a shot across the bow against guys like Giroux and Jake Voracek, because a lot of those years they were thrown to the wolves, 2014-15 and 2017-18 in particular, where 17-18 was a roster that probably had no business in the playoffs to begin with, given their goaltending and Andrew McDonald and Robert Hagg being consistent top four defensemen. But they were kind of dragged there by some elite individual seasons, by Giroux, by Voracek, by Sean Couturier's breakout year, by Shane Gostisbehere's 65-point year, Ivan Provorov finally breaking out as a number one defenseman. And, guys, even let's say a strong season by Valtteri Filppula, even though he kind of faded off into obscurity near the end of that season. But I just think that it was kind of a cop-out to blame it on cap restrictions and a unique season and everyone's handling the compact schedule differently. Because, again, if we were, let's say, the Pittsburgh Penguins or the Washington Capitals experiencing a season like this, then, yeah, that argument would hold significant water. But given what has gone on here since 2013-14, since Homer stepped away, and how this group has kind of had reoccurring themes here, despite who the coaches are and despite who the GM is and despite who the supporting cast is, it's kind of alarming that was the GM's approach to it.
Yeah, to say the least. Talked about how Morgan Frost is ahead of schedule and that he should have a normal off season and things like that. And they signed Max Willman to a contract. Has been a pretty good find, a late bloomer. Not sure that he'll ever make it as an NHLer, but I mean, this is minor league stuff. Just literally, this is not the important stuff. This was a year that they had to make some progress after finally breaking out of the doldrums, and it just, like I said earlier, it became unraveled. And it sounds as if, unless there's forces above Chuck that are saying, the belts are real tight this year and there's nothing we can do, and we got to hold out until we get a regular year with more revenue, more butts and seats, and then our hands are tied. I don't know. I'll leave that to other people. Maybe some of these reporters that know people in the building, if they have the good word on what's going on, or maybe Chuck is playing poker here and he's really got something up his sleeve and he doesn't want to give it away. I don't know. All I can tell you is he should have come out, in my humble opinion, and said, this won't stand. We're evaluating everything, and stay tuned. That's what I would have said. Would that be unreasonable?
Not at all. And, I remember in 2013, October, when they fired Laviolette, and I think this may have been the final presser that Ed Snyder did in this kind of capacity. And I remember he got quite triggered about someone who asked him if the culture needs to change and this and that. And look, I still think that firing was premature about Lavi, but he basically said that based on what had gone on in the 2013 season and what he saw in training camp that spilled over into an 0-3 record to start the 13-14 season, that it wasn't acceptable. And look, in some ways, you don't want someone, an owner or a manager, who's so quick on the trigger like that and impulsive, let's say a Jerry Jones out in Dallas. But at the same time, you still respect that fire. You still respect that unwillingness to stand for a losing culture. And I think more so than anything else now is that this team has a losing culture that was instilled by Ron Hextall and hasn't been corrected by Chuck Fletcher. And we can look to last season and this, that, and the other thing. But, even last season, aside from late January to the pause in early to mid-March, were they not a very, inconsistent, mediocre bunch as well? And it's, today it's, I kind of reignited the whole Paul Holmgren conversation and making jokes of him, with a WWE theme coming in to make the save on the organization. And look, I think in a lot of ways, the game passed Paul Holmgren by. Ditto for Bobby Clark, and they made a lot of mistakes to their own right. But at the same time, I think, and I can only speak to myself in particular, is that you're missing that fire and that absolutely zero tolerance for losing that you would get with Clark and you would get with Holmgren, even if it was sometimes to their own fault that they would make moves impulsively that would lead to, a negative outcome. But the point still stood that they did not accept losing. And I think what we saw with Fletcher here is, you could take the whole, he's playing chess and not checkers, and he's playing poker and he doesn't want to show his hand. And it's a more, long-term approach. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, Fletcher has kind of sat on his hands here since June of 2019. He really came out swinging when he first got hired. He cleared out a lot of the dead weight on the team, and guys like Jordan Wheel and Christian Folin and Dale Weiss. And, he brings in AV, he brings in Braun, he brings in Niskanen, Pitlick, Hayes. But since then, what has he really done to push this team forward on the ice? And I would argue he's regressed it back to a 2018-19 type of team, especially given the fact that, he didn't go in with really a backup plan for the goaltending. So, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt until the end of the offseason, until, he has a real offseason, for the lack of better words, to really fix this thing and right the ship. But the lack of urgency in his comments and, the overall complacency that's kind of emulating off of him in the franchise right now, it's really concerning for me.
Yep. We'll have to see. Actions speak louder than words, but we were not inspired by those words. But that was almost like 3 segments right there. So why don't we move on to the next one? And we may have to get to some others at another time. We talked what led to this whole press conference, although it was a mid-season press conference. I mean, you had that occasion, in addition to the Flyers earning some explanation from people up above, is this talk about how the process is this and the process is that. We're going to win. And I think that doesn't wash anymore. I mean, at some point, results are what counts. We know they came out with a not playing the right way, like Larry Brown used to say back in his era when he was the coach of the Sixers, the right process and playing the right way. It's more or less the same thing. But one big difference this year is even when they weren't playing their best, they were getting goaltending. And that's all part of it. And he did mention today that the goaltending wasn't good enough. But I sense the frustration from AV, and there just seems to be no answers. And in previous press conferences, he made allusions to the fact that the group here wasn't good enough. And then he kind of had to backtrack on that yesterday when asked about that, when they tried to get him to or manipulate him, the people in the press, into saying something to that regard. But it's a lot of claptrap at this point.
Well, I think it was you who said that if it was a regular season and they were playing well, that loss to the Islanders on Monday would have just been chalked up to, it happens and we wouldn't even have thought about it. That was you, correct?
Right.
So it's more because when you're losing and even when you are winning, aside from those back-to-back wins against the Sabres, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks ago right now?
Right.
Aside from those 2 wins, like, we were talking about how poorly they were playing and winning in spite of that. And, they got goaltending in the first month or so. That's since fallen off, and now it seems like the quote-unquote process, and, just a side note, I hate that word.
Oh, God, please get a synonym fast. Pronto. Let the photographers out there get a synonym we can bank on.
Like, it's like, look, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, but, I mean, if you can't tell with your eyes, just go look at, the underlying metrics. Like, they're playing the same caliber of hockey right now as, like, the San Jose Sharks. And I mean, I think that the Flyers just have more talent, and that's why they've been able to, overcome some of their overall poor play here. But I mean, they're consistently just not playing well, and it's just and for me, it's like whenever they go down, like the adversity that's really like they just cannot overcome. And more so than that, I've talked about it a lot with Dan on Brotherly Pod that, like, I don't like to theorize too much as to what's going on in the room because I'm not there and I can't speak to it, and at the end of the day it's all just speculation. But it really seems that there's something off with the team. And it's almost getting to a point now, and because, you lose 6-1 and 9-0 inside the span of a couple of days, that even if you were to add an Ekholm or an Ellis or both, along with a Mantha or a Bertuzzi, we've spitballed off the air through text. Do you think, and I'll ask you this directly because of how long you've watched this team through all these different eras, do you think that even on paper good acquisitions or good on paper acquisitions would be enough to overcome what's going on with this team? Because is it getting to a point now that as long as this pre-existing core is here, that has lasted the span of 3 general managers and 5 head coaches, will anything change?
No. You know why? They've never done it. They have nothing to fall back on. That's why Niskanen was so important. That's why you had cred in the room. So you take that out, and then you have a bunch of guys who were known as bellyachers, whiners, rabbit ears, like Voracek, who blocks everybody. These are guys that can come back when the pressure is not on. But in the playoffs, since 2012, after that, they really haven't done that well. And I had a discussion with a younger fan who was a nice kid who said, well, the core is not really here anymore. I said, well, as long as you have Giroux, Couturier, Voracek, and JVR, those are the people that this team looked upon. Shem was gone. Simmons was gone a couple of years ago, and his play had diminished despite, the type of rep that he has in terms of character. But as long as those guys are the pace setters, there's an issue. You can't ignore it, or else you wouldn't see the same thing over and over again. I think it was Einstein. The definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Now, of course, that was in a scientific context, but there is a kind of a mix, a brew, and I'm not going to say it's a toxic brew. It's not Buffalo. But if you let it fall off, it can really fall down. We've seen that. And like I said earlier, we've been at this since 2014 with the Hextall project. Here's how I feel about it. I would not hesitate to acquire players I can move forward with. I don't want rentals. It's a waste of time. If you get a rental, but you have spoken to the agent and you feel like this player could have a future here, you have preliminary contract discussions, the agent is someone you've worked with in the past, and you have a reasonable certainty that this is a player that you want to have on your team next year, great, then fine. Other than that, start drawing a line in the sand like Ben Franklin, plus or minus, and evaluating a decision, and say, this guy is going to be with us. This is a plus player for us. This is a minus player. And you may not be able to lose the players you don't want this season in the trade deadline, and he's saying he's not looking at selling now, he should look to sell and buy, like I said earlier. Start
100%.
molding your new team like you did in 06, 07, knowing that the situation is nowhere near as dire. You have kids that could bounce back, and you have some you can let go of and maybe get some other kids that have better matching skill sets, and maybe the chemistry would be a lot better. But you fundamentally need to change this team. This club is so dependent on the aforementioned players. Without them, they are lost. And we see that. All the young kids, with the exception of Farabee, have either stagnated or worse, fallen back. So it is time to turn the page. The Hextall project failed. Now let's go about the business of retooling, knowing it's not going to take 7-8 years like what was, playing out. And that's how I feel about it.
I like that what you said about how the current group has nothing to fall back on, because I've heard a lot of people say, like, well, look at what Boston did. They retooled on the fly and they kept, Marchand, Bergeron, Krejci, and Chara. Or look at what Los Angeles is doing. Kopitar, Brown, Carter, Doughty, Quick. And I was just like, they won Stanley Cups. They're proven winners.
That's right.
How can you draw comparisons between a group of players who have won Stanley Cups and another one that has gotten past the first round twice in 8 years or whatever it is?
Yeah.
I'll use another example, and I'll use the Ottawa Senators. It's fair to say that they did the most extreme type of rebuild that you could go to. And I remember in the offseason, they moved on from Ron Hainsey and Mark Borowiecki. And those two were both alternate captains last year. And Borowiecki in particular, I was kind of surprised by, because he's an Ottawa guy. He comes from there, grew up there, does a lot for that community. And I spoke to a guy who's out there in Ottawa who covers the team. And because they got rid of those guys and they bring in Eric Goodbranson and Braden Coburn. And I think that we could make the case that at the very best, that's changing 4 quarters for a buck, right?
Yep.
So I asked, like, what's the point of that? Like, why not just hang on to Hainsey and Borowiecki? And like I said, in particular, Borowiecki. And he said something to me that I have not been able to get out of my head, particularly applying it to the Flyers. He said that the Senators this year want to bring in a new leadership group. And you look at that team, you have Chabot wearing an A, you have Tkachuk wearing an A, who's probably the next captain, Tim Stützle, Jake Batherson, Nick Paul, all these guys. He said, how can you give this team the reins, or this group of players the reins to lead this team into the next era, when you have lingering members from the old era and leaders hanging around? And it's kind of true. And you look at the Toronto Maple Leafs as well, when they did their scorched earth rebuild. They could have hung on to guys like Tyler Bozak as the third line center, or JVR as a depth winger, or a second line winger, let's say. They could have made the financials work instead of, let's say, bringing in John Tavares at $11 million a year. But they wanted to turn over a new leaf. The only guy that they kept from that old era was Morgan Riley, and he was drafted in 2012. So you can make the case that he was part of the new era and just caught the tail end of it. But they traded some guys who were still young, like Nazem Kadri is arguably the best second-line center in the NHL with the Colorado Avalanche right now. But they needed a change, and now they've handed the reins to Matthews and Marner and Nylander. And that's not to say that going all in with just the kids is a good approach. Absolutely not. You need veterans, and you see as to why the Leafs had to address that, but they brought in outside veterans like Thornton, like Simmons, like Bogosian, like Brody, but not veterans from that pre-existing group that was instilled in a losing culture during the Burke/Nonis era Toronto Maple Leafs in the early 2010s. So I think that you got to get to a point with the Flyers where when you think of that organization, and I could tell you, because I'm up here in Canada and I listen to a lot of national television, that when people bring up the Flyers, the first names out of their mouths are Giroux, Voracek, and Sean Couturier. Giroux, Voracek, Couturier. Giroux, Voracek, Couturier. They even throw in JVR there because he's had 2 stints with the club. The Flyers have got to get to a point where when you think of that organization, you think Joel Farabee, Carter Hart, Oscar Lindblom, and Ivan Provorov, depending on where you fall on him. But the only way you're ever going to get to that is until the Girouxs and the Voraceks and the Couturiers even, although you can make the case that he could hang around, but I would argue differently, not just for intangible reasons, but for contract reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into, are gone. And I think that the proof is in the pudding that even if you look at a team that has done the same as the Flyers in the Calgary Flames, of hanging on to a pre-existing core that hasn't won anything, and now they're continuing to losing the Calgary Flames, and now they have another coach in there with that group of players, it doesn't work unless that team are proven winners.
Yeah, it's hard to argue. They need more players in here. It's one of the reasons why Jágr had such an impact, even though he was not really a shell of what he was, but he was about 70% of what he had been as a player. He instilled a lot of confidence. They admired his work ethic, and he pumped those guys up and helped them believe. I mean, Voracek was a certain kind of player when he got here, and he became a better player for all of his faults because of the exposure, in my opinion, to Jaromir Jágr. So that's just one example. And I think the Flyers do need to do that. Whether they want to hang on to Couturier and pay him in his probably declining years, I think that's going to be a topic of conversation for a different show. But if the Flyers are that dependent on those guys and the other kids aren't ready, then maybe it is time for a different kind of team. And it has to happen. And they can't. It's like going back. There are some Hollywood couples like Liz Taylor and Richard Burton just kept getting married and getting divorced, and they couldn't live with each other and without each other. And I think the Flyers are in that circumstance right now, and something's got to give, because the fans aren't going to rush back and put themselves at any risk to watch this garbage, because that's what it is. It's garbage. They need a fundamental change, and it will involve a parting with at least 3 of the 4 players you mentioned, and I don't have a problem with that. Sometimes you just have to start anew for all the reasons we've outlined. And that's all I have to say. You want to add anything else?
Well, obviously you've been watching for several decades, longer than I have. But when I bring up how bad this era has been, a lot of people allude to the late 80s and early 90s. And someone said that Mr. Snyder stepped away from the team for a bit. Could you shed some light on what went on then and why it was different than what's going on right now?
Well, I think he wanted a succession plan, but Jay Snyder took over, and he let Bob Clark go and brought in Russ Farwell and oversaw that era of Flyers hockey. The Flyers topped out in 1989. And then went through this fundamental change that I'm referring to into the 90-91 season until they made the Lindros trade. Farwell was still the GM at that point. And I think Bob Clark entered back into the picture, and Jay Snyder went out. Maybe he just didn't have the passion. I really do forget how everything went down, because I think the concentration at that point was on the Lindros deal is the most spectacular moment in Flyers history off the ice. It was a different time. He was building a different team. Like Russ Farwell came from the Western Hockey League, and he was building it a lot like it reminded me of what Hextall was doing. He was going to draft. He drafted Forsberg. That kind of surprised some people at the time. It turned out to be a really shrewd pick. And I like some of the things he was doing, but it didn't have the feel of the Flyers of being a tough team to play against, more of like an efficient, more skilled team. And that was maybe what Farwell was trying to build before Bob Clark came into the picture after Lindros. And I honestly do forget how they did that, whether they named Bob Clark to a certain position and Russ Farwell just left, or I really do forget. But that was the lowest point for a protracted amount of time. I'm not counting the early period when they're coming into the league. You got to give them some grace, right? So when they got Bobby Clark and they made the Flett Lonsberger trade for, I think it was Bernier and Bill Lezouk, and they also got back Jean Potvin, who was Dennis Potvin. Imagine if they got Dennis Potvin in that trade. Look out, right? But they got Jean Potvin. And that kind of set them on the course for their Cup years. But to your point, the question, this has been the emptiest period in Flyer history because they had the one big down year when Clark and Hitchcock got sent packing and Holmgren came in.
Yeah, well, like that 06, 07, that was like probably the first year that I really followed religiously. I started at the tail end of 05, 06, but, they bring in Stevens, but he started tinkering right away, and I think that's what you're alluding to, and what Bill mentioned in his thread today, is that you don't have to be on one side of the fence or the other 100%. Like, they sold and they bought.
Exactly.
Like, they brought in Braden Coburn. They brought in Lassi Kukkonen. They settled their goaltending before the offseason when they brought in Marty Biron. They sold 100% when they traded Forsberg for a first, a third, Upshaw and Perrin, and then that set them up to acquire Briere and Hartnell at the draft table or right before the draft. I forget exactly what day it was, and they subsequently signed each of those guys to 6-year contract extensions. I remember it's funny now that I work for them. But I remember the first time I was ever introduced to the fourth period was during that season. And they were reporting that Holmgren and the Flyers were going to be in on Danny Briere and Scott Gomez and Chris Drury that offseason. And they ultimately signed the best of the three in Danny Briere.
No doubt about that.
Pardon me?
I had no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I mean, you could speak to this better than me, and I'm not talking about trades here, but Danny Briere, is he not one of the greatest free agent signings in the history of the franchise?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was the right move at the right time. It didn't end well, but everybody knew that going in. The contract like that wasn't going to end as well as it began, but it was such a shot of energy and life into the team. They needed skilled players. Briere was part of that Buffalo team that used to just haunt the Flyers and put some really bad losses on them in the regular season and the playoffs. And to see a skilled guy like that come in, it really made such a difference. And, I think you could make that case because, even the Forsberg signing, you knew that he wasn't quite the player that he had been. But, what really made a difference also was the emergence of some of the younger players like Carter and Richards, especially Richards, becoming even a better player than the organization probably thought in 08. So he takes that, like Farabee's having a nice step-up year. Richards, if you could imagine going back to that year, was even better in terms
Incredible.
Yeah, it really was something from 07, 08. And it was he became a premier defensive two-way center in the league that teams were dying to have. And that, it's the combination. So what I'm thinking along the lines of what you're thinking is that if the Flyers could get some veterans that have some credibility and maybe some others that bring some excitement the way Briere did, that give them a skill set. So maybe a shoot-first player like a Line A or what have you, and combine that with the growth that they're seeing from Farabee and a rebound for some of the players like Myers, Sandheim, Provorov in particular, and Konechny. A lot of these guys are counting on. It could really make a difference in 1 year, but the GM needs to help that along.
Well, another thing that people forget about that offseason of 07 is that they brought in 3 captains. Tiemann was the captain of the Predators. Briere was the co-captain of the Buffalo Sabres, kind of a foreign concept nowadays. And Jason Smith was the captain of the Oilers, who became the captain for that 1 year of the Flyers. And, the guys wearing the A were Gagne and Mike Richards. You had Danny Briere, Kimmo Timonen not wearing A's, although Timonen wore the A for law that season because Gagne struggled with concussions. You still had guys like Scott Hartnell and Mike Knuble. They brought in Jim Dowd, who was a journeyman NHLer at that time, and I think he wore the C for the Minnesota Wild for a brief stint in the early 2000s. It was just everything was addressed in that offseason, intangibly and on the ice. And, you still had Darian Hatcher, who, correct me if I'm wrong, was he not the captain for a short stint following the retirement of Keith Primo in 05-06?
He might have been. That's something I got 51 years of the club, and you got me on that one.
I'm pretty sure that when Primo went down in early 05-06, they put the C on Darian Hatcher before handing it over to Peter Forsberg for, 4 months in 06-07 when he barely played.
Yeah.
So, it was just such a fundamental change, and it's not like they gutted the roster. They kept guys like Gagne and Mike Knuble, and Sammy Kapanen, who hung around for that one season as well in 07-08. But again, it's not even comparable because that team did have a winning track record. And look at the changes they made after one season. This is 8 now. We're going on a decade, and you still have guys lingering around, even from the beginning of 17-18. So that's 4 seasons as we're wrapping up the 4th season since the beginning of 17-18. They still have 11 players. Elliott, Haig, Gostisbehere, Giroux, Voracek, Raffl, Provorov. The list goes on, and it's just, I don't understand why are you keeping this team so intact that has achieved nothing? Even last season in the playoffs, they technically got to the second round. Yeah, they did, but they had to scrape by the 24th seed Montreal Canadiens to get there.
Yeah.
I
don't want to belabor the point, but I think I do want to kind of move on to the last topic, only because we're trying to have a concise show. But I hear your frustration. And we are getting a little repetitive, both of us, because it's frustrating that if you go by the words of Chuck Fletcher and the actions up to this point over the offseason and so far as things have played out, the actions haven't matched what the promise was when Chuck Fletcher was hired. He gave it a go. It hasn't worked out for this group, and it's time to start making changes. All right, so last one, and we'll do a combo here. The chatter, and maybe you could help us with your fourthperiod.com connections. The Flyers, according to Elliot Friedman, may be changing focus from Ekholm to Ellis. Ryan Ellis is wrapped up past this year for, six more years, as opposed to Ekholm, who would only be tied up for 1 more year. So the rationale is Ryan Ellis is a higher quality defenseman, although he doesn't bring quite the snarl that Ekholm does. But he's a really good two-way defenseman who would fill the bill for the Flyers if they were to acquire him. But he's also on a very cap-friendly deal, considering the type of player he is, at looking for his deal. He's actually on the IR right now, but he's making $6.25 through the next, what we've got here,
until he's
27.
35.
Yeah,
right?
Which is fine. Defensemen, age better than forwards. So the idea is, instead of taking that risk with a left-handed Matthias Ekholm, who's really on a very good deal, why not aim higher, be willing to give up more for a guy you're tied in with, owing to the fact that position obviously has been proven to be one of the top 4 or 5 positions on the entire team, with your number 1 defenseman, number 1 center, goaltender, you name it. This top pairing player that needs to go with, say, for example, a player like Provorov is gold. You have to have him, and you should be willing to give up assets, but you have to have him tied down contractually, so you don't, roll the dice, take a risk, and then Matthias Ekholm could leave the team as a UFA in 23. How do you feel about that? And is the chatter you're hearing along those lines as well?
I think stylistically, it's a much better fit. I think Ellis is a better player. I mean, he has a proven track record of being a top pairing defenseman as opposed to Ekholm, who's kind of always been the second pairing guy. And Ellis has been up there on that top pair since they traded Weber back in 2016. And I like the cost certainty on Ryan Ellis. I mean, you're getting him locked and loaded for 5 or 6 years beyond this season. Obviously, he's a right shot, and it would be the ideal fit for Ivan Provorov, and it would go a long way, and you kind of, settle that discussion as your top two defensemen for the foreseeable future. And another thing is that he makes less than Ivan Provorov. So, I mean, the cost certainty is great. You would have your top two defensemen locked in for less than $15 million based on my quick math, which I admittedly isn't all that good. So, I mean, you're going to have to pay more for him, obviously, because he is a better player and there is much more significant cost certainty on him. But I think it would be the better move, to be quite honest with you, because I do think Ekholm has, that snarl and that physicality that the Flyers so lack. And I still think they would be best served to address that, even if it isn't through acquiring Matthias Ekholm. But with Ryan Ellis, there's a reason why less than 2 months ago, Elliot Friedman reported on Sportsnet that he was an untouchable along with Roman Josi. I think they've realized what some teams, and if I were to venture a guess, I would directly, refer to the Winnipeg Jets, are willing to pay up for a guy like Matthias Ekholm. So David Poile is probably thinking to himself, well, if I could get this for Ekholm, a second pairing guy with 1 year left on his deal, what could I get for a guy like Ryan Ellis, who's a top pairing guy, a right shot defenseman, which obviously always come at a premium, with more cost certainty at an affordable cap hit. And we've heard, the cost of what it would take for a guy like Matthias Ekholm. We've heard, DB say 2 second-round picks, then something like Ghost to first and Zamula. We've heard all varying things, but I think if you're going down the path of a Ryan Ellis, it would be a much more significant ask. And if I had to speculate based on some people I've spoken to, it would start with 2 roster players. For example, I'm not directly mentioning these names as to what I've heard, but if I were to speculate, Sanheim and Konechny along with a first-round pick. Now, is that a lateral move? Is it a step forward? Is it too much to give up based on the age discrepancy between Ellis and the 2 aforementioned Travises? I think that move makes the Flyers a better team in the here and now. But I think if you're going for an Ellis type of player, I think that's the kind of deal you're looking at.
Okay. Is it possible they would want Phil Myers instead of Travis Sanheim?
I think so. I mean, Phil Myers, it depends where you're at, right? I think that Phil Myers is attractive to a team that is kind of building more towards long-term sustainability. And this applies for the Flyers as well. If the Flyers are not going to put the onus on winning in the here and now, then you're going to invest longer term with Phil Myers because he's a right shot defenseman. He has a higher ceiling. The cost certainty is there at $2.5 million for 2 years beyond this one. And I think that's more, to be quite honest with you, more of an attractive piece for the Nashville Predators because they are going to be giving up a right shot defenseman as opposed to Ekholm, who's a left shot. So if you trade Ryan Ellis and you acquire Travis Sanheim, Dante Fabro becomes your de facto top pairing guy on the right side, or you're having to play Ekholm or Sanheim on the opposite side. So, yeah, I could see 100% them valuing Phil Myers more. But for a team that, let's say, is in win now mode, I think Travis Sanheim is the better defenseman in the here and now. But again, on an expiring contract, he's probably going to get somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.5 million on a new contract. So look, I think it's very possible that they would ask for Phil Myers over Travis Sanheim. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, it remains to be seen whether the Flyers think that that kind of 5 or 6 year window is one that they could win a Stanley Cup in. I mean, that's really where the rubber meets the road. And if it's not, you're going to wait till the off season and maybe get into the free agent market, go after somebody like Doug Hamilton where you don't have to give up assets. Then when combined with the expansion draft, then you could shed some salary there and you have a protection scheme that you feel better about. I could understand, well, why a GM may feel immobilized in that regard. But I think Konechny is a player that can bring you down the road, but it just depends on what the Flyers' timeline is. And that's why I think they ought to draw the line in the sand, like I said earlier, and determine what is that timeline, who we are, and what needs need to be addressed. Either way, the Flyers are going to need a player that can play on a top pair. And that player is very important, and they realize it now more than ever, because I think that is really the first thread, as I mentioned earlier, that allowed this thing to unravel. Last one before we go. After a defenseman, what's the next move for the Flyers? Is it something as simple as like a two-way guy who can play, but maybe add some snarl, some muscle? We've seen the Flyers get pushed around for way too long. It's almost like they became the anti-Flyers.
So I'm going to assume that that's with the idea that we're sticking with this group of players like Giroux and Voracek and all that.
No, just in general. Again, regardless of who's going to be here, send a message that you're changing course. That, to me, is the most important accomplishment this year, is to establish with the guys that are going to be here that we are making a fundamental change. If they don't do that, and there's a sameness going into the offseason, I think that's going to have damaging effects as well. Seeing guys get ragdolled, push their face into the ice. Oscar Lindblom having to fight because everybody's just standing the hell around. I mean, what the hell was that?
It was embarrassing.
Yes, it was.
But yeah, so with that in mind, I think you have to bring in, and I don't think one forwards you can cut it. I think you need to bring in two guys that can play in the top nine, one of which preferably could play on a top line, that brings some of that snarl and that type of net front presence and that hard forechecking that we're missing. And I think even if it's as simple as trading a Konechny for a Mantha, which, you know, talent-wise, they're probably a wash and value perspective, but at least it's a change that you're not going to be taking a step back, and it addresses intangibles. And that also goes for a guy like Tyler Bertuzzi. I think bringing in two players like that to kind of set the tone that they're two significant adds. So you bring in those two guys in favor of Travis Konechny and, let's say, Jake Voracek or JVR, whichever one's easier to move, to be quite honest with you, between JVR and Voracek. I think you need to bring in two significant players that bring a different element. And even if it's, you know, you're quote unquote losing in the talent on ice department, it's a move that has to address the intangibles, guys that are going to change the mentality, who are not going to allow for a guy like Oscar Lindblom to fight. You know, that like I just said, it was embarrassing. So I think beyond fixing the defense, you need two players with that type of game. And not like, and you've said before, not like Zach Ronaldo or whatnot. And you also want to make moves and acquisitions to bring in guys that will be here for the foreseeable future. You don't want to, let's say, go out and sign a guy who's like on the back nine of his career, but he can, like a David Backes, let's say, who's going to skate on the fourth line and he's been around the block and he's going to ultimately be here for a year or two max. If you bring in guys like Anthony Mantha and Tyler Bertuzzi, who are still in their mid-20s, and Mantha in particular has some cost certainty on him, a very similar contract to that of Travis Konechny, that will be part of this team and grow with like the Farabys and the Provorovs and the Harts and Lindbloms and whatnot, I think that would go a very long way into kind of sustaining this group for the long term.
Yeah, it's just the acquisition cost. Steve Yzerman's not the kind of guy who's going to want a player like JVR or Voracek
Yeah, of course
I think,
not.
Ron Francis at Seattle might be interested. We were talking about that as well on our last show. Maybe JVR is somebody who might be attractive. Maybe get Gostisbehere, although he's starting to fall back again. So it just depends. The Flyers are in limbo right now. But either way, it's not good. And I think the whole franchise needs to have that I guess you call it a cathartic moment where we're starting to clean out the deadwood and create something new. There has to be something like that for this organization, or else they're just going to die on a vine. This is what happened under Hextall. And I think it begins with breaking the dam open with some of these top 4 players somehow, some way. Fletcher today said nobody wants to take salary back. If you're willing to let go of a player you like a Zamula, a Bobby Brink, and some of the other players, even some of the pro-ready players, like Allison and Lazinski, as much as they've been waiting for those guys, and now they're starting to play well, and the Phantoms are fun to watch anymore. You have to do what you have to do to put the Flyers in a direction where this thing is just changing, and they can build upon that and create a new culture. The culture here is broken. They tried to fix it back in 2014. It hasn't worked, and it's time for a change. I'll give you the last word.
I mean, it's they're running out of time here. They're really, really running out of time. If not, they've already have run out of time. And I will say that, they could shock us with a few miracle acquisitions during the offseason, like Amantha and Bertuzzi and, two of Larson, Ellis, Hamilton, Savard. But I still question that as long as these guys who have worn the letters on their jerseys for 8 years now are still here, I question whether or not anything will change in terms of becoming a championship contending team because of just this lingering era that has just been centered around losing.
Losing, mediocrity. When mediocrity is more or less your best in the overall, and like we referred to earlier, it is the standard by which they're measured for their careers. Not individually, but in their tenure with the Flyers. It's not like the Bruins. It's not like the LA Kings. And I think there's a lesson to learn from that. And with that, we are going to say, hey, we're sorry. We really didn't do 5x5 today, but it's a special kind of occasion. The Flyers are at an inflection point. I've said it earlier. And it is time for something to change, and we wanted to address that. Anthony, where can people find you on social media, and where else?
You can find me at DiMarco25 on Twitter, and you can find my work at thefourthperiod.com.
Terrific. And I am Isaiah, ISAIAH _520 Isaiah. Don't forget the underscore 520. And of course, you can follow the O&B Puckcast on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. We have a Facebook page, a YouTube channel. Please rate and subscribe on the podcast platforms. And, just want to thank Jamie Basco from FlyersNittyGritty.com. We have some sponsors. You heard one. Just a reminder that you want to make sure you get to Jim's South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia. 4 decades of the best cheesesteaks, hoagies, fries, you name it. That could be delivered to your door if you're down there and you can't make it over through DoorDash. So just remember, Jim's South Street at 400 South Street. And with that, we will be back with a regular show on Sunday, and we'll see what goes down. We hope it's something different from what we've seen so far. All right, folks, everybody, take care.